Greetings, travelers! I am Nickelhypa, and I have finally returned to the mysterious fabric of the interweb on this new YouTube channel to continue on with my never-ending criticisms of Final Fantasy VI and its primary antagonist, Kefka. In the two previous episodes in this series, I debunked some of the most common and most shallow arguments that fans and critics present in praise of Kefka. If you haven't seen those videos yet, find them on my channel and check them out if you wish. It's now time to take on some claims and arguments for Kefka's greatness that have more substance to them than the classical brain-dead and easily refuted statement Kefka is the best because he actually succeeded in his goal. This video is going to be a direct response to a video essay by the YouTube channel Broguelike. The title of their video is Kefka vs Sephiroth, who is the better Final Fantasy villain? And the person in the video starts by laying all their cards on the table immediately by claiming Final Fantasy VI's Kefka is a better villain than Sephiroth and it's not even close. I will not dissect Sephiroth in this video, nor make a case for his villainous superiority here. I do think Sephiroth is a much better written character and simply a better antagonist than Kefka, but this video isn't about Sephiroth. This video's purpose is to demonstrate that Kefka isn't well written. That's it. Please be aware that I will tackle Broguelike's arguments out of order. For this reason, and because his video is worth a watch, I recommend that you check it out to hear his entire argument before hearing my rebuttal. That said, let's get started. Broguelike's second argument for Kefka's greatness is his design. No argument there. Yoshitaka Amano is a masterful artist and character designer, and Kefka has good design that reflects both his villainy and his ridiculousness. Broguelike's fourth argument for Kefka's greatness is the Mad Jester's macabre sense of humor. Again, no complaints from me. Broguelike makes a very good case with this argument too. It is actually amazing how in-depth and intellectually impressive Broguelike's analysis is here, which makes it all the more disappointing how his first and fifth arguments, ones that I perceive to be his core arguments, fail to reach the same level of quality. This brings us to his first argument, and the one argument in his video that fails and misses the point most miserably. Broguelike starts by comparing Kefka to the Joker, stating there's something primal and primitively terrifying about the Joker, something that makes our skin crawl just when he's on screen. Kefka has the same effect, and I think it's for the same reason that makes the Joker so fascinating a villain. I see a problem manifesting itself here already. If a villain has the same exact reason for being frightening and fascinating as another villain that predates him, that's not very original, is it? This is a minor issue in the grand scheme of things though, so let's move on. Broguelike continues by calling Kefka a violent, unpredictable nihilist who is nonetheless cunning enough to engage in psychopathic acts, and adds, you fear the psychopath because of their plots, their machinations. You fear the insane nihilist because they have no machinations, they just act impulsively with utter disregard for everyone. Kefka can and does play both roles as a villain, he's doubly evil in this way. Fair enough, if Broguelike and like-minded Kefka fans wish to consider Kefka extremely or even doubly evil, so be it. There's no arguing that Kefka is indeed incredibly malevolent, destructive and corrupt. However, Kefka's duality of being both a psychopath with machinations and an impulsive nihilist with no machinations feeds into a major flaw with his character and his arc that I will soon discuss. Here's a quick summary of the rest of Broguelike's first argument. 1. Kefka does not present himself as a figure in power. He is physically unintimidating and constantly outsmarted by the hero characters. 2. Kefka represents the dark side of humanity that exists within us all. 3. Kefka is a good representation of real-world individuals who would become like Kefka when given a chance, such as brutal autocrats, abusive parents, or school shooters. 4. In addition to being an idea of the chaotic forbidden side of man, Kefka is also extremely cunning, extremely ambitious, and becomes extremely powerful. At this point, the problems with Broguelike's first argument should become very noticeable. For starters, his argument contains several contradictions. It also contains irrelevancies and ignores some key factors about Kefka's character, and each of these problems in some way feeds into the others. The first and most undeniable contradiction is how Broguelike claims that Kefka is extremely cunning, while also admitting that the heroes repeatedly outsmart him. I don't wish to waste time by repeating what I said in previous videos, but just know that in them, I gave a list of instances where Kefka acted in ways too dumb for me to even accept that Gestalt would have forgiven him and still kept him in a position of authority. Broguelike is also right in saying that Kefka gets outsmarted frequently, and this doesn't allow much room for claims that Kefka is cunning, let alone extremely cunning. The second contradiction presents itself in the examples that Broguelike gives of real-world evildoers. The problem here is that if Kefka is more than just an idea, If he's supposed to be and is intended to be an actual character with defining character traits, then he cannot represent both brutal autocrats and school shooters. Those two categories of real-world villains simply aren't similar enough for Kefka to work as a representation or metaphor for both of them. To me, this claim reeks of an attempt to make Kefka sound badass or cool by saying that he is essentially a sum of all the evils of the world, in which case, he really should have been an inscrutable, barely comprehensible Lovecraftian villain, not a crazy human being. Consider this. Could somebody with psychological issues so serious that they shoot up a school ever get into a position of power such as being a dictator of an entire country? Yeah, probably not. Becoming a ruthless autocrat takes more than access to guns. It takes actual cunning, it takes intelligence, resourcefulness, and most of all, patience. These are all characteristics that Kefka doesn't possess. But what about the idea that Kefka does not present himself as a figure of power, as he's only 5'4" and weighs around 50 kilograms? This claim is both wrong and sort of irrelevant. It's irrelevant because as a mage, Kefka need not be as physically intimidating as Sabin to strike someone down. It's wrong and misses the point because Kefka has a position of power and behaves like a person in a position of power. Not physical power, but political and military power. The game presents him as one of the 4 most powerful individuals in the Gestalian Empire. Kefka has an entire army at his command. Here's something that I find interesting though. Kefka, being a little guy and dressing ridiculously, was actually a solid foundation for telling a story about a villain that represents the worst of humanity. Consider the following historical figure: Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister of Nazi Germany and one of Adolf Hitler's closest and most devoted associates. Do you know how physically imposing he was? He wasn't. He was a very short person and his health was consistently poor. Add to that the fact that he was thoroughly evil and you have one of the worst people in history, one that is similar to Kefka, or at least the way Final Fantasy VI presents Kefka during its first half. But here's the difference. Goebbels was cunning. He was a very skillful public speaker. I once read in a history book detailing the way the Nazis rose to power that when Goebbels used to take the stage in a venue he'd never spoken at before, the audience would often giggle and smirk at his physical appearance, until he began speaking. And when he finished, the people that had made fun of him before were now completely enchanted, as if under a spell. That is the power of language, the power of effective demagoguery, and the power that actually makes real-world autocrats scary. It doesn't matter how evil Kefka is, how many forms of evil his fans claim he represents, or how cunning or intelligent those same fans falsely claim he was. So long as the one thing that is truly frightening about real-world villains, the ability to manipulate the masses into giving them power, is missing, Kefka doesn't work as a great villain or an acceptable representation of the worst evils of humanity. And that ability is missing in both Kefka's backstory and his main story arc. He is not a great villain and he never could be. Could we successfully compare Kefka to a school shooter or a permanently drunk abusive parent? Probably yes, but when compared to the most dangerous individuals in human history, Kefka's evil ways fall short. His personality is devoid of the cunning, the resourcefulness, the intelligence, and the patience needed to stir the hearts of the people and to gain power. The only reason Kefka has any power or achieves victory is because the writers say he does, and hand him the victory by introducing a lazy plot device, the goddess statues that were FF6's equivalent of a nuclear launch button. School shooters don't have access to nuclear buttons, and the real-world autocrats that have access to nuclear buttons are way more complex and cunning than Kefka. This brings me back to the chaos cleverness or psychopath nihilist duality of Kefka. It's because the writers indeed attempt to make Kefka both a psychopath and a nihilist, something that Broguelike praised, that Kefka ends up being a poorly written character, a walking contradiction only sustained in the plot by contrivances. Kefka wants to revive the statues and ascend to godhood. He also wishes to poison the entire population of Doma. Those are the machinations of his psychopathic side. However, he also treats his subordinates like garbage and cannot hide his true nature and intentions from them or even from Celes. The soldiers in Kefka's army don't just lack respect for him, they downright hate his guts. That's the result of Kefka's nihilistic, unpredictable side. The problem is obvious. These two sides cannot work together properly to produce a successful military leader, one that would be of much use to Gestalt. This is evidenced by how Kefka constantly fails in his assignments or runs away from the heroes. As Broguelike himself said, Kefka is repeatedly outsmarted. Kefka also gets his own hands dirty, which is not something a clever psychopathic manipulator would do. A truly intelligent and cunning villain would preserve his own public image and delegate the dirty deeds to his subordinates. Thus have both the writers of Final Fantasy VI in their writing of Kefka and Kefka's fans in their praise of said writing conjured up such a massive mountain of contradictions, it is not at all unfair to say it's a classic case of wanting to have your cake and eat it too. As far as Kefka's writing goes, I'd even say it's a classic case of throwing everything at the wall and hoping that something sticks when there isn't even enough room on the wall. Broguelike's fifth argument brings up the following points. 1. Kefka doesn't need power to be an interesting character. What makes him interesting is how he gets power and what he does with it. 2. Unlike most villains, Kefka does interesting things with the power he has attained. 3. Kefka is willing to be a coward to pursue his goals. This is a positive thing because most writers are afraid to let their villains show weakness. 4. Kefka isn't like so many other villains whose arrogance is their undoing, a boring trope that is extremely common among villains whose defining trait is their power. I've already touched on how Kefka gets power and why all of it is poor writing in previous videos, but let's quickly go over it again, since it is relevant to showing just how wrong Broguelike's first point is. Kefka gets his ultimate godlike powers because his superior, his emperor, who has mysteriously forgiven him for all of his past screw-ups and doesn't think taking a genocidal maniac up to a nuclear launch button-esque MacGuffin might be a bad idea, brings him along to that MacGuffin. Kefka then pushes the MacGuffin out of place to blow up most of the world, but not before absorbing its power by asking for it. That's right. Kefka stands in the middle of the warring triad and screams, "I demand, give me power." And then, he gets the goddess's power and can control their magic lightning beams to kill his former superior, Emperor Gestal. As a thought experiment, imagine that I'm telling this to someone who has never played Final Fantasy VI and doesn't know what happens on the floating continent, or at least doesn't know what happens in detail. Just imagine how wrong and lazy it must sound to anyone who isn't already a fan of the game or a fan of Kefka, to know that our supposed complex, cunning, and even legendary villain gets his powers because he asks for them. If there's a worse story with a more contrived MacGuffin somewhere in another Final Fantasy game or any JRPG, then I haven't heard of it. Allow me to turn directly to Broguelike here and ask, what on earth do you mean by Kefka is interesting because of the way he gets his power? If by interesting you mean the most lazy and contrived way ever, then yeah, it's interesting. Let's move on to the second point in Broguelike's fifth argument. According to Broguelike, Kefka does interesting things when he attains power. Well, for those of you who don't know or don't remember, after the world quote-unquote ends, Kefka sits at the top of his metal tower and occasionally nukes a town with his new powers. That's it. That's all he does. Once again, I must ask, what's so interesting about that? A villain that has the power to destroy a town from a distance occasionally destroys a town from a distance. Are we supposed to be impressed by this? Or are we supposed to consider this high quality characterization? What the filifionka? The third point in Broguelike's fifth argument is that Kefka is more interesting than most villains because he is a coward and appears weak at various points of the game's story. I'll give Broguelike a half a point for this, because I agree that this trait is relatively unique in JRPG villains. However, as previously stated, Kefka is a walking contradiction, and his cowardice is a part of that contradiction. You can't get away with constantly losing and or running away as a general, when the ruler of your country is a ruthless psychopath like Gestal. Especially if your own soldiers despise you, it just doesn't make sense. I'm going to bring in a comparison out of left field to illustrate how poorly written Kefka is, both in his weakest and his most powerful moments. Griffith. And I can already hear Kefka fans rending their garments because even the most hardcore fans of FF6's Mad Jester know that comparing Kefka to Griffith is as uneven and one-sided as having a paper plane battle the Apache Guardian. This isn't fair, I know. There probably isn't a single Final Fantasy villain that can hold a candle or even a matchstick to Griffith from Berserk, but I don't care. I'm bringing up Griffith anyway, because I quite enjoy humiliating and exposing Kefka. Spoilers for Berserk ahead. Kefka looking weak pales compared to how weak Griffith looks during many parts of Berserk's Golden Age arc. At one point, Griffith resorts to self-harm to wash away his emotional and physical trauma. And he's literally broken in every way at the end of this arc. In fact, Griffith falls so far that the audience might logically conclude that there's no way back for him. Even though the beginning of the original manga tells us that Griffith will become more powerful than ever before after these events. Griffith's eventual victory and success also bring with them an interesting moral dilemma for our heroes and the audience. If Griffith is able to establish a peaceful and prosperous kingdom in a world as dangerous and horrifying as that of Berserk, and if it is only Griffith holding that safe haven together, is it even moral or ethical to want Guts to get his revenge and kill him? Obviously, those of us who have been reading or watching Berserk for years or even decades hate Griffith with a passion, and want to see him get his comeuppance, but at what cost? That is what it looks like when a story does interesting things with a villain who has achieved victory. I wish to reiterate that comparing a 1994 Super Nintendo video game villain to Griffith is almost unforgivably unfair, but I had to make this comparison just to show how much better both a villain's weak side and his power can be handled in a fantasy story. Broguelike's fourth point in his final argument compliments Kefka because his downfall isn't caused by him becoming overconfident and arrogant, something which Broguelike, probably justifiably, considers a cliché. But there's a problem. Kefka experiences a downfall. Kefka loses at the end of the game, and his eventual defeat makes even less sense than did his ascension. As far as fantasy villains, especially Final Fantasy villains, who start out as mere mortals go, Kefka is probably one of the most powerful ones, if not the most powerful one. Unlike Sephiroth, whose most powerful attack, Supernova, is recognizably an illusion and can't actually destroy the solar system, Kefka's Light of Judgment is a real force, as the game clarifies that Kefka has the power to destroy towns in a single attack from his tower. So why does Kefka lose to 4 or fewer mortals at the end? Because he's the bad guy, that's why. Which in this case is the same as to say that he loses for no reason whatsoever. The only thing worse than a villain whose demise is brought about by a cliché is a villain whose demise is brought about by nothing. Now, is this nitpicky, considering that villains always lose at the end? Yes, it is nitpicky, but in my view, nitpicky complaints are fine when analyzing a villain that is supposed to be and is proclaimed to be one of, if not the greatest video game villain of all time. When presenting his fifth argument, Broguelike started by saying that he hadn't previously brought up Kefka's power because Kefka didn't need power to be interesting. Dare I suggest that the reason he didn't bring it up was instead because everything about Kefka's power, especially his eventual defeat despite his insane power levels, makes little to no sense. Dare I suggest that? Okay, that last comment was in jest. Second guessing the motives of someone who has put a lot of effort into their argumentative video isn't nice. In all seriousness though, Broguelike's last argument was almost as weak as his first one. This just leaves us with his third argument, in which Broguelike claims Nobu is a brilliant composer and the final boss theme, Dancing Mad, is his magnum opus. Kefka's character theme is also brilliant and sums up his personality and arc very well. This argument particularly interests me because I am also a composer/musician, and even though I've only officially released one album back in 2017, I still occasionally write and play music. You can check out this video on my channel to listen to some of my newer compositions to decide for yourself if I am any good. None of this is to say that I am an absolute or even semi-absolute authority regarding music or composition. I am firmly in the camp that believes knowledge of music theory and skill on an instrument do not automatically translate to superior taste in music. The previous information is only to set up why I feel like analyzing this argument more in depth, not to give my opinions extra weight. So, Dancing Mad, I don't care for it. I don't think it's one of Nobu's best songs, let alone his magnum opus. Is it an admirable piece, and does it have its moments? Sure. Is it better than One Winged Angel, To Xanarkand, Theme of Love, Liberi Fatale, the music from the opening scene of Final Fantasy V, or You Are Not Alone? Not in my ears. I actually think Kefka's character theme itself is superior to Dancing Mad, and here's why. Dancing Mad lacks the one quality that many great pieces of songwriting throughout history have had. That quality is hummability. Seriously, you might be able to remember and even hum a few parts of Dancing Mad, but most of it is as needlessly complex, wanky, unmemorable, and borderline random sounding as a 2000s or 2010s era Dream Theater song. I can say with hand on heart that long before I picked up a guitar and learned to play it, long before I was able to do anything listenable on a piano, I was able to memorize and hum all of To Samarkand, One Winged Angel, or even simpler but just as effective songs like Aerith's theme, Theme of Love, Rose of May, Eyes on Me, or whichever other great Nobuo Uematsu track. Just try to hum the melody in Dancing Mad that starts at the 13-minute mark, or the one at 6:14. It's impossible. These and many other parts of Dancing Mad are complex and show-offy to the point where they're completely unmemorable and unhummable. They're not interesting either, they're just complex for the sake of being complex. If you say that not all great music needs to be hummable, I agree. That is why I specifically said earlier that hummability is a quality that describes a lot of amazing pieces of music and not all of them. But here's the thing. Final Fantasy VI is a story-driven JRPG, a game that is supposed to give you the feels and have you emotionally invested. It's not a horror game where unhummable ambient drone music would fit better. Nor is its soundtrack part of a competition where progressive rock superstars get together to see who can fit the greatest amount of unmusical, annoying, borderline incomprehensible arpeggios into 1 second of playing. And if you still think I have no reason to criticize Dancing Mad for its needless complexity, allow me to put forth the idea that this kind of track and this kind of attitude in composing is antithetical not just to musical storytelling, but to Nobuo's own usual style. There used to be a documentary about Nobuo Uematsu on YouTube, maybe it's still there, I haven't checked. But in that documentary, Nobuo said about his own music, well, it's simple music, so it's easily received by people. There's nothing simple about Dancing Mad. It's complex. Too complex for me to enjoy it on any level other than an intellectual one. I can admire the work that has gone into such a track, and I can analyze it from a theory standpoint, but it makes me feel absolutely nothing. It fails in the one task that Nobuo is almost always successful in giving me feels. The best I can say about Dancing Mad as a piece of the soundtrack and a part of the game is that it is a perfect metaphor for Kefka's character writing. They have thrown everything at the wall, and this time the wall is just as small or even smaller, considering that any well-prepared player will finish Kefka so fast that they won't be able to experience even a fourth of the intended boss battle track. If you like Dancing Mad, fair enough. I cannot and do not want to take that away from you. I just really don't see where people are coming from when they say this song is Nobuo's magnum opus, when songs that have more emotion, better melodies, and more memorable execution all exist not just in other Final Fantasy games, but in Final Fantasy VI itself. So yeah, that last one was largely a matter of taste, but I felt like addressing it because I don't like Dancing Mad. So, let's wrap up this video, shall we? Broguelike makes some compelling points in his video, and one of the 3 arguments that pertains to Kefka's writing, that which addresses the jester's dark sense of humor, is particularly well presented and a perfectly fine reason to consider Kefka a good villain. I mean that. I may not agree with Broguelike's overall conclusion or find all of his arguments convincing, but I do appreciate his efforts, and I once again encourage everyone to check out his video and leave at least a like, whether you are a Kefka fan or not. For my part, I believe I have presented at least an adequate counter-argument to Broguelike's line of reasoning. It is up to each and every one of my viewers to decide for themselves which one of us made the better case. Is Kefka a better villain than Sephiroth? Is he the greatest villain ever? Or does he fall short because of the flaws in his writing that I pointed out? You decide. Please do let me know your opinion in the comments. This concludes my series of videos about Kefka. I believe I have debunked or at least countered all of the arguments that fans and critics commonly present in praise of Final Fantasy VI's main villain. There are no more arguments left, there is nothing else left to... Wait a minute. What the Devin Townsend is this? Final Fantasy VI and Kefka, the most nuanced and interesting villain in classical JRPGs. A game theory by Matt S. of digitallydownloaded.net. Foucault on Kefka? Machiavelli on Kefka? Holy crabapple! Somebody has actually written an article praising Kefka in which they invoke Michel Foucault's and Niccolo Machiavelli's philosophical ideas as part of it? Well. It looks like my job isn't quite finished yet. Matt S., Kefka fans, allow me to quote the Terminator. I'll be looking at this article very soon.